teach marketing and international business in the T. Boone Pickens College, and Dad is in the department of, Dad Kelso is in the Department of Economics and Finance, same college, and we'll be talking about today's book, Looking at the Sun. But we gave you a couple of handouts. One is a brief summary of the book, and the other handout, which is on East Asia. I fixed a project last year which will be published this month, I believe. It will be coming out. So it's some of the references are used in that project, and they are only on East Asia. It's economic development economics, all the things which have been discussed by James Follows. So very briefly. Now in the book, they have cited quite a few book reviews, but I had some extra book reviews which I did last year, and it will be interesting to see what exactly other people thought of James Follows. Wall Street Journal, April 15th, they think that an unmitigated MITI lover, MITI stands for Ministry of International Trade and Industry from Japan, and some of the people in this country, they did not like MITI because it was kind of a big brother helping all the companies, so I will talk about later. Far Eastern Economic Review is published from Hong Kong, and they have to say something about James Follows' book. Great stuff. Unfortunately, it's seriously flawed and just plain wrong. And the next one is Japan Times. I subscribe to Japan Times, and they were not bad. It says that it also remains to be seen what will happen in East Asia when the party is over. So how do they deal with their hangover? And because right now East Asia is going through some problems which Follows did not cover, because the book is about 3 to 4 years old. And then finally Financial Times, which is just like another Wall Street Journal but published from London. And they said, just as looking at the sun causes blindness, so gazing at our Asians' best emerging economic and social system can dazzle the mind. James Follows, Washington editor of the Atlantic Monthly. Now who is this James Follows? Most of you know that. He worked at the Atlantic Monthly. He was the Washington editor of the Atlantic Monthly magazine. And for the last 6 months, he joined another company, not another company, but another publication. He's the editor of now the U.S. News and World Report. So it happened, I think, in the last 6 months. And he's a Rhodes Scholar. His writing style is excellent. I like it. But some of his thinking, I don't really agree. And the reason is because he belongs to a new school of thought on Japan, and which is called the revisionism. I'm also fixing a project on this. Now what exactly is revisionism, and who are these people? There are 4 main guys, and these are mostly called the Gang of 4. Gang of 4, the first one is Chalmers Johnson, sorry. He taught at UC San Diego. He's retired now, and he's an expert on Japan. The other person is Wolfram. His name is Karel von Wolfram. He's a Dutch. He was the speech writer for Mr. Carter, President Carter in the 70s. The third person is Clyde Prestowitz. He also wrote a book, a good book on trade. And he's a trade advisor, I think, in mid-80s in the Reagan administration. And the fourth one, of course, is James Follows. Now, James Follows is kind of a little bit radical. These are all these, what do you call those intellectuals, and they try to establish a school. It's still under construction, this school of thought called revisionism. And what exactly they say? They say that Japan is different. So if Japan is different, it cannot be considered part of the Western world. So what's their main strategy and remedy? Let's be tough. Let's beat Japan. Let's force Japan to open up, all the Japanese markets. And that's why they are somewhat different from the mainstream Japan specialists. So it's kind of a big fight going on. You do read once in a while in the New York Times and all these publications, Wall Street Journal, about Chalmers Johnson and Prestowitz. But lately they have slowed down because Japanese economy is also going through some problems. So these are some of the basic introductions. And now you know why this book was written, because of the school of revisionism, although James Fallows does not mention too much about his school in this book. So Dad is going to talk about the first 5 chapters, and I will take the last 5 chapters. Okay, I'm going to talk about chapter 6, 7, 8, and 6 through 10. I'll just take 10 minutes because I think we are running out of time. The reason, as I said before...
We're doing okay. Take 20. Move it up.
When he wrote his book 4 years ago, one of the major reasons was because Cold War was going to be finished. And so historically we had a bipolar world, Soviet Union and US and its allies. But now we live in a multipolar world. And a lot of countries are trying to compete on the basis of their competitive assets or edges. So those days are gone when you had only 2 big giants hitting each other. And then in mid-80s, when we started to see all these countries collapsing, so it was a big opportunity, it was a pretty big niche. And that's why there are a lot of books coming out under this domain or under this topic. In fact, the latest one is written by one of the guys from Harvard University International Studies Institute. His name is Samuel Huntington, and his book title is The Clash of Civilizations. Excellent book, little bit controversial, but you will love it. I mean, I don't really agree with all the things he said, but it's a continuation of this Fallows book, and that's what we are witnessing. That there is no Cold War, but we have a one war which is going on all the time, every day, every minute, every second. What is that war? It's called trade war. And that's what we business people always try to investigate, what's going on, why Japan is doing so good, why Malaysia, why Taiwan, Hong Kong, all these countries are going crazy in terms of their wealth, in terms of their assets, in terms of their technologies. Suddenly in the last 10 years, the whole ball game has changed. So that's what I think he touched under these areas from chapter 6 through chapter 10. And he tried to discuss all these things. But again, as I said, Fallows is one of those guys. His writing is a little bit controversial, but you get to know a lot of things. And it's very important sometimes to disagree. If you agree all the time, I think you may lose your own comparative edge. It's okay to disagree, it's okay to challenge people. But again, there is a one limit, within if you stay within all the limitations. So in chapter 6, what he talked about was, in chapter 6 and 7, he talked about 3 countries. And these are some of the Asian countries, what you call it Asian miracle or Pacific century, or there are so many terms used in all the magazines we read every day. Asia's exporting economies or high-performing economies, whatever. So the first group is those countries having growth without development. I mean, they are doing very good, but in real sense, the long-term development is not there because there are some problems, environmental problems, pollution, corruption, one of the nightmares of the developing world, and the country I come from, it's one of the worst national disgrace we have, and that is called corruption. Now, do we have corruption in this country? Of course we do, but it takes a different form. It's mostly a white-collar corruption. It's a corruption you cannot really identify right away. It's a corruption in the form of lobbyists. It's a corruption in the form of changing your agenda. But the corruption we see in the developing world or East Asia, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia is one of the most corrupt in these days. If you look at the list of all the 50 countries, Pakistan is the second last on this list. And it's very embarrassing to be dealing with this system. India is there, number 10, no, number 8. And Thailand is there among the first 10. Indonesia is there. Japan is also there. Very, very corrupt in some aspects of their society. And that is called political structure. In the last 10 years, they had almost 6 to 7 prime ministers. So what does it signify? A very, very corrupt society, but in some areas they have done outstanding job. I mean, you love to buy their electronics and cars and Lexuses and Infinity because maybe under that there is some value. So basically, he said countries having growth without development, These countries are Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. And he talked about these countries in a very interesting way. Malaysia also. Now Thailand, he talked about that it's a purest illustration of all the industries guided by the government. Everything is controlled, all the state enterprises and whatever. About Malaysia, he talked about that it's one of those underdogs, it's one of those countries, where everybody's trying to work hard. Their prime minister is always fighting with the Western world. His name is Dr. Mahathir. He's not a PhD, but he's a real doctor. Most of us are not. So Mahathir, every time you read Wall Street, New York Times, any newspaper, his name is always there. Why? Because he's fighting, because he believes that some of the countries do not get fair treatment from the Western world. And one of the reasons Malaysia is working hard, and they have a lot of foreign direct investment coming in. And by the way, they are also building the tallest building in the world. If you go to their capital in these days, it's going to be World Trade Center and all these buildings. So basically, when you are an underdog, it's a matter of survival, and that's where you go back to the animal kingdom and you say survival of the fittest. So that's the approach on the part of Malaysia. Now then he comes back to one group which is called Overseas Chinese Business Networks. Now we did not use this term OCBNs. But this is a new term we are using in these days, and it's coming from East Asia. He has used the term ethnic Chinese. Now what happened is, in the last 60, 70 years, a lot of Chinese came out of China. And there are about 55 million of them in this world. In this country, Canada, Singapore, Hong Kong, Indonesia, they constitute only 3%, but they control 70% of the economy. Very, very rich. All Singapore is controlled by ethnic Chinese, and that was a pretty interesting thing. But I thought maybe he could have done a little bit more time under this topic, because it's a pretty relevant topic. And they are also found in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Hong Kong. Hong Kong, you go to Hong Kong, you will see money. You can easily see money, of course it's not visible, but you can see the way they live, buildings. Almost every 10th car is a Rolls Royce.
What do you call them?
Overseas Chinese Business Networks, OCBNs, and there are 55 million of them, and they control almost all the wealth of East Asia. So that is one of the major contributing factors behind East Asian miracle. And they are still doing very good. Of course, it has to do with their real estate and all the businesses, because they are mostly into retailing, distribution, development, property, and real estate. And that's where you make money all these days, even in this country. Okay, the third country he talks about, Indonesia, very briefly. It's an island state, very tough guys. Of course, there's a one guy, he's there for the last many years. When I was in junior high, he came into power, and he's still there. And that's one of the problems behind developing world, and he did not discuss really too much from that perspective. But basically, Indonesia, they say, it's not really a rigid Islamic society, it's kind of pretty mixed. And the second group of countries he talked about, and those countries are not important, so basically they are on the sidelines, so I'm using his statement. And what are these countries? Burma, North Korea, the Philippines, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. And what's the problem? Again, problem goes back to the main problem I told you, corruption. Leadership problem. Too many times government will change, or somebody staying there forever. In this country, after 4 years, at 8 p.m. you see somebody losing, they come on TV and they say, sayonara, thank you, I loved it, goodbye, I will see you, I will build my own library, and next year we'll see you back. Now over there, when you lose, you come on television and you say, I'm not going to leave, I'm going to stay here. So that's the major problem behind some of the East Asian countries. And I think he has discussed some of these things, especially leadership, problems in leadership, environment, around these. The third group of countries he talked about, and he said these are the main contenders. Contenders mean they are doing pretty good. South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore. Now, if you look at these countries, their system is really not similar. and they are going in a different way. But if you look at their exports, it's unbelievable. We have some Taiwanese students last year, and still they think they are number 2 or number 3, although in some areas they have done excellent. So basically, psychologically, some of these countries still think that they are under the umbrella of Japan. And they still want to imitate Japan in almost every aspect of their life. Now, South Korea, he spent a lot of time discussing South Korea, and some of his early writings, because I monitored follows before in my own research work since 1987, and he did write a couple of papers on Korea, and they were published in the Atlantic Monthly. And the same ideas he had from those, papers, and he said that South Korea is trying to catch up. But the problem with South Korea is not Japan. And the reason is because Japanese society was more homogeneous. South Korea was American ally for a long time. The whole geopolitical structure and the social setup is completely different. So, but they have one thing, and that is they feel very inferior in terms of competing. Now you take any South Korean product, and they will still be number 2. Number 2 means they are not really Panasonic or Sony or Pepsi or Lexus. But of course they manufacture a lot of cars, and they allow only 5% cars in South Korean market to be sold from other countries. 95% models are still made in South Korea. And that's how those countries are under the name of protectionism. They are trying to protect their economies, and it's been going on in all those countries. And then he said Japan was big enough to incubate industries domestically before exporting to the outside world in 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. So that was a wonderful learning curve. They incubated a lot of companies, excellent industrial policy on the part of Ministry of Finance and Ministry of International Trade and Industry. But South Korea did not go through this sort of profile. The whole metamorphosis or all the things happened in South Korea, it came out to be a pretty different deal. And South Korea is still not closed. Of course, they are developed. But if you go to Seoul, you will see a pretty, dual society. And people still are not, they can't really compete because all the parts manufacturers, they are in Japan, and they ship everything to South Korea, and they manufacture in South Korea. Now, one thing he did not mention in his book because it was maybe too early. If you look at the strategies of South Korean companies, Hyundai and Gold Star and Lucky Gold Star and Daewoo, they are going overseas big time in terms of investments. You go to Ireland, you go to England, you go in this country, Oregon, all these places, Poland, Hungary, they are investing big time. So maybe they are trying to imitate now the way Japanese did it in 70s and 80s. All the transplants, almost 50% of the Toyotas are manufactured outside of Japan. And they have almost 3 or 4 plants in this country. And Nissan and all these places. So that's where they are imitating some of the countries. So basically, it's a pretty good discussion he had about Taiwan, Korea, and all these countries. And he also mentioned one thing, and going back to overseas Chinese business networks, and he said that in Taiwan, you don't see really a huge corporations like it happened in Japan and Korea. But in Taiwan, you have mostly family-based companies. And that's where you go back to OCPNs. Of course, there are some companies coming out from Japan, they will be very big. Taiwan, they will be very big. One of them, you buy their computers, they are such a hot commodity in this country called Acer. And it's such a big product in these days. Other one is Formosa Plastics. Investing a lot of money in China, all the Taiwanese. So basically, they are still small, maybe down the road after 10 years. So that will be another Korea. Now, Singapore is too small to compete on that basis because they have a different niche. So in the end, after these chapters, he talked about Greater China, and he said that could be another big force in international trade and international business. And he's also talking about Taiwan and Singapore within that perspective. So I think that was a little bit too early. Because the problem in international trade is that things are changing so fast. Even in 1 year, you see so many things happen. So some of his things in this book, they are very well valid, but they are a little bit old because a lot of things happened in the last 3 years, and that's where we have to watch out. Now, chapter number 9 talks about the impact of the Asian system, and he has discussed environment, migration. It's a chronic problem in all the East Asian countries, including developing world. People moving from rural areas to urban areas for the sake of good quality of life, education for their families. And if you go to some of the countries, especially in Shanghai, if you visit Shanghai, you never see sun because it's so polluted. There is so much smoke. And in our own country, the country I come from, we were there last month, miles and miles you see smoke, and these are the trade-offs of development in all the East Asian countries as well as developing world.
Are you from Pakistan?
Yes. And then he has discussed another interesting concept in chapter 9. He called it sentimentality and ideology. I didn't understand this word sentimentality. But under that he quoted one guy, he gave a reference to one guy. His name is Shintaro Ishihara or Ashihara, Ishihara. Now Ishihara is a Japanese. He's like a Ross Perot in Japan. And he's big time Ross Perot over there. He's a fighter. And he's always bashing US companies. He's always bashing the US government. And he said that basically these people, when you are an underdog, when you are not a rich country, when you are trying to develop, you have more dignity and pride, and you are always a fighter. So that's what he tried to read. But if you want to read Ishihara's book, it was out in 1987-88. Japan that can say no. And it came out to be a very, very controversial book, and it was translated by the US Congress, although it was not available here, and then it was released in this country, and I bought it in 1989, and it was a pretty big issue. At that time, many people in this country did not like Ishihara, and he also tried to run for the prime ministership, but I think he didn't have sufficient votes. And he's still into politics, but that was a good example under ideology and sentimentality. Now, one statement I would like to quote from is chapter 9, and this is page 412. Now, I have a hard cover. I didn't use my paper pen since I started this book 2 years ago. I still use my hard cover, and it's on page 412. And he said that the Asian model is not superior in any sweeping sense. It is more confining for individuals, as Pam mentioned. It has so far proven inferior in generating new scientific knowledge and fostering known creative talents. It will encounter shocks, setbacks, and slowdowns in the coming years. So what he's referring to, he's trying to, what portraying is that in the Asian system, of course, individualism doesn't work, mostly Confucianism and group-oriented society. So in most of the Asian countries, you don't see too many Bill Gates or Steve Jobs. You don't see too many Lone Rangers, who can come right away and take all the market share in 2-3 years. And so to some extent, I think he's correct. But I think he is kind of trying to too much simplifying the whole issue, because there are many, many companies from East Asia. And they started from, look at the example of Acer. This guy started this company 15 years ago, and now his company is $5 billion from Taiwan. And he has plants in this country, Ireland, England. So I think in that case, the book's data is a little bit old, because as I said, things are changing so fast in the world. Now, there are some other issues he has discussed. The Asian impact on the world. He has discussed some advantages and disadvantages. The brand plan syndrome, that's where he talked about the transplants coming to outside world. All the Japanese companies coming here, and they are investing big time, billions of dollars. And the examples he has mentioned is IBM going to other countries, Fujitsu coming here. And then he also talked about some of the Japanese problems happened in late 80s. One of them, as I said before, meeting Ministry of International Trade and Industry, FSX deal. FSX was a deal between US and Japan when Japanese wanted to acquire US technology for their fighter planes for the 21st century, something like that. So that was a pretty controversial. Some of the conservative thinkers in this country, they said we shouldn't be delivering this technology to US because Japan is always a copycat. They always, have a free ride, free lunch. They always imitate us, so we need to protect our technology. But the deal, still was okay, late 80s. And overall, I think he has discussed some of these examples, which are very relevant, and I found those very interesting. Last chapter, which I thought will be a pretty big chapter, long chapter, and he will discuss all the things of all the chapters. It came out to be pretty short. Maybe he wanted to finish his book. There was a deadline from the publisher, and so he wrapped it up, and that's why I was kind of not really satisfied with the chapter 10, but I will summarize it very briefly. And he said that Asians, all the whatever wonderful miracles they have, it does raise 5 questions. Under education, industrial strategies, intervention by the government, trade policies and investment. Pat has already covered some of the areas under industrial policy and industrial recommendations given by the state to industries. But in education, he has discussed U.S. school system very briefly in 2-3 pages, and then he said U.S. can learn from the successes of Asian system. Now, again and again, media talks about this issue, and that is we all know that our school system is a big mess in this country, but our university system is, they say, one of the best or the best in the world. Now it's a pretty strange contrast that here you are losing all at the high school or junior high level, and then at the university level you get all the cream of the cream and from other countries, and the system is such that it creates a lot of innovation. It breeds into a lot of industries, and that's where you have all the bright minds at MIT or Harvard or all these big universities. So that was, I think, a pretty good statement. Under industrial strategies, he said industrial political guidance, and that has been happening in those countries, and he said we need to learn from that area. Now, it's kind of a very controversial debate. Even in this country, there are 2 schools of thought, and some people say we should not intervene, and some people say we should intervene. Like some of the advisors we have, Laura Tyson, Robert Reich, and they are all behind this revisionist thought. I mean, they will not come forward and say, I'm a revisionist. Only these 4 guys have the courage to come out and say, we are the revisionists, although some of them have already gone back. But follow still is part of that school. And then the third one, intervention by the government, same continuation of some of the ideas which we just discussed, trade policies and investment. Now, as I said before that, my area, I teach international business and international marketing, and it's fun to teach this area because the pace of change is so fast. Every 2 years, you have so many things happening. Every year you see Japan's trade surplus creates a big nightmare in this country, and people say, we need to stop and this and that. Well, last time when I calculated the last 20 years trade surplus, Japan's trade surplus with the US only, it comes out to be about $500 or $600 billion. And for the last 10 years, the trade surplus has been 45 billion to 50 billion average. And 60% of the trade surplus is in one area. And the responsibility goes to all the consumers because you buy too many cars. 60% of the Japanese trade surplus is only in one segment of your economy. So basically, then when you come down to one issue which Pat just mentioned, that we are not really a communist or socialist society. If it comes down to here, it's my wallet. I will spend whatever I feel like. You can't tell your people buy their American cars and this and that. So that's where the main confusion is. You live in a free society and free world, so you really can't tell people what to do. But overall, as I said, one thing will change down the road, and that's what he did not mention. Maybe it was written in mid-80s. Competition, the whole concept of competition is changed down the road after 6-7 years. And that is, countries are going to compete aggressively. It will be like a big fight. Those days are gone when you could hide under the umbrella of, US power or Soviet allies could stay with the Soviets, and you were protected by those countries. That's where Huntington talks about that clash of civilization. And competition is going to change. More and more industries are going to be extremely aggressive, and people, they will export and they will manufacture in other countries. In some areas you will lose, in some areas you will gain. So if you go, if you discuss all these concepts, you will smell some of the things coming out of this book. I mean, he did mention some of the things, and he's kind of a little bit concerned and nervous that we need to be tough. And that was the main issue behind the Japanese, the US revisionists. Now, my last statement, I just want to make sure that I conclude this book by giving you some of the top things, what's happening today. And sometimes we say we need to be tough with Japan, but you can read some of the figures. Today, Japan is the world's largest donor nation in terms of foreign aid, I think about $9 to $10 billion. Japan now covers 73% of the non-salary costs of the US forces stationed there. And that's another controversial area. The US is by far the leading foreign direct investor in Japan, while Japan is the second best direct investor in the US, as Pat mentioned. In 1995, Japan was number one in the purchase of US's agricultural products because it's a huge economy, the second largest economy in the world. Japan's merchandise trade surplus with the US's declining, I have a question mark, because if you know what happened, the yen is now 116, and the last 2 weeks the Japanese market also collapsed, so yen is again depreciating, it's not appreciating, and that's where your exporters are going to lose and their exporters are going to gain. So that is another controversy, but again their surplus is going down, but very slowly. And the last point I have, and I'm doing a study again in this area, there are 149 Japanese multinationals included in the Fortune's Global 500 list versus US's 151. And the largest company in the world is Mitsubishi, $184 billion. Now these are some comments, some ideas, some food for thought. Now you can imagine that it's a love-hate relationship between the US and Japan. And the world trade is so much interdependent, you can't think of separating yourself. And these are some of the issues which I thought that it was not mentioned in the book because it's a pretty current data. Now, 20 years ago, you could count how many Japanese multinationals were included in the Fortune 500 list. Not more than 10. 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And now you are talking about 149. And you go to one area in Tokyo, you could see all the big buildings and all the multinationals of Japan. A lot of money, a lot of power. But they still want to stay as an underdog. They still want to be under the umbrella because they still want to bow and they still want you to protect them. They spend only 1% of their GNP on defense. So these are some of the controversial issues, and that's where I do not really agree with some of the revisionists, and they say, let's hit Japan, let's force them to open up their markets. Of course, it's a both-way street. If you lose, they also lose. And many countries will also, because any time when you sneeze, the impact or the after effects you will see in Mexico, you will see in Europe, because you are the biggest economic engine of the world. Thank you.
Thank you.